The old plantation house stood at the edge of the woods, its weathered frame a relic of a forgotten past. Its windows were dark, staring out like hollow eyes, and the wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of untold memories. The house had been abandoned for decades, and now a new family had arrived, unaware that they were stepping into a nightmare that had been festering in silence for centuries. James and Rebecca, along with their two children, Lily and Daniel, were full of excitement and apprehension as they pulled up to the sprawling estate. They had spent months looking for the perfect home to escape the busy, bustling city life, and the old plantation home seemed like the perfect retreat. It was isolated, beautiful, and rich with history. However, beneath its charm lay a dark and tragic past. The plantation had once been a thriving farm, tended by slaves who worked the lands from sunrise to sunset. The house had been the home of a ruthless and cruel slave master named Thomas Forsyth, who had owned dozens of slaves throughout his life. In his eyes, the workers were mere property, and he treated them as such. In the years following Forsyth's death, the house had been sold multiple times, but no family ever stayed long. Strange things had been reported, objects moving on their own, eerie whispers in the middle of the night, and glimpses of figures in the windows when no one was there. Each family that moved in had been haunted by something they couldn't explain, and in every instance, tragedy struck. The Forsyth family had been long gone, but the house remained as a testament to their cruelty and the countless lives lost within its walls. The ghost of the slaves, bound by rage and torment, lingered, their spirits trapped in the home, seeking revenge for their untimely deaths. As James and Rebecca settled into the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, it was little things, the feeling of being watched, the occasional strange noise in the night. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew more intense and more sinister. Rebecca, feeling the strain of her troubled marriage, often found herself wandering in the house at night, unable to sleep. Her relationship with James had been on the rocks for months, and she felt a growing distance between them. He was absorbed in his work, and she was left to care for the children alone. The isolation of the plantation only deepened her loneliness. It was during one of her sleepless nights that she first saw him. A figure, dark and imposing, stood at the edge of the hallway, his form barely visible in the shadows. He was tall and wore the tattered remnants of clothing that had long since rotted away. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his face was contorted with sorrow and rage. Rebecca gasped, taking a step back. The figure didn't move, but she could feel his presence in the room, heavy and oppressive. She turned to run, but as she did, the figure spoke, his voice deep and melodic, though laced with an undeniable sadness. "You've come to this house, but you do not understand what it holds," he said, his voice echoing in her mind. "You are not the first to enter, and you will not be the last. We are bound here, and we will never leave." The figure seemed to dissolve in the shadows, vanishing as if he had never been there, but his words lingered in her mind, gnawing at her. Over the next few days, Rebecca found herself drawn to the house in a way she couldn't explain. She wandered the rooms, listening to the whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The more she listened, the more she felt a connection to the spirits that roamed the house, especially the one that had spoken to her. The ghost's name was Elijah, and his story was one of suffering and injustice. He had been a young man born into slavery on the Forsyth Plantation. He had worked the fields alongside his family, enduring the same cruelty that all the slaves had. But Elijah had been different. He had a quiet strength, a sense of dignity that set him apart from the others. He often found solace in the woods, away from the harsh gaze of the master. But his defiance had not gone unnoticed. One fateful day, he had been caught trying to escape, and Thomas Forsyth had made an example of him. In front of the entire slave population, Elijah was whipped and then dragged to the house, where Forsyth beat him mercilessly. In the end, Elijah had been hung from a tree, his life snuffed out in an instant. But even in death, he could not find peace. His spirit, along with the spirits of the other slaves, remained bound to the house, seeking vengeance for their torment and deaths. As Rebecca spent more time in the house, she began to hear Elijah's voice more clearly, urging her to listen up, to understand. The whispers became commands, and slowly they began to cloud her judgment. She was no longer just hearing the voice, she was feeling it inside her very soul. Rebecca's mind began to warp under the weight of Elijah's manipulation. She was no longer just a lonely woman in a house that felt alive with the dead. She had become a pawn in a much darker game. Elijah promised her that if she helped him, if she allowed him to take control, she could have everything she had ever desired. And so, Rebecca began to fall under his spell. She would stand before the mirror for hours, talking to the ghost, her reflection slowly morphing to the likeness of someone else, someone unfamiliar. She became consumed by the idea of helping him, of setting the spirits of the slaves free, no matter the cost. It was then that the family began to unravel. James, oblivious to the changes in his wife, became increasingly frustrated. The tension between them was palpable, and the house seemed to magnify their problems. Lily and Daniel, sensing the growing unease, began to act out, their behavior becoming erratic and violent. One night, Rebecca finally made her move. Elijah had promised that if she did this, she would be free, and the family would never have to suffer again. All she had to do was lead them to the trap. She invited James into the study, where she had set up the scene. The walls seemed to close in around them as Elijah's influence thickened the air. James sat at the desk, his back turned to her. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of the wind outside. Without warning, Rebecca turned and locked the door, trapping them inside. From the corner of the room, Elijah's shadowy form materialized, his eyes glowing with hunger. James turned to face his wife, confusion etched on his face. "Rebecca, what's going on?" he asked, his voice shaking. But Rebecca didn't answer. She stepped back, her eyes glazed over as if in a trance. The whispers in her mind had grown louder, drowning out everything else. Elijah was there, standing behind her, his cold presence wrapping around her like a shroud. James stood up, his eyes wide with terror. He rushed towards the door, but as he did, the room seemed to shift. The walls closed in, the floor groaning beneath their feet. Elijah's voice echoed in their minds, a low, guttural whisper. "You could not escape," he said. "This is your fate." Rebecca's hands trembled as she reached for the knife that had been hidden beneath the desk. She had been planning this for days, and now, with a swift motion, she drove it into James's chest. Lily and Daniel were next. As the house claimed its final victims, the ghost of the past danced in triumph. Their thirst for revenge had been quenched. In the aftermath, the house stood silent once more. The bodies of the family lay lifeless, their blood staining the floors, and yet the whispers continued, their echoes carried on the wind. 2 months later, another family arrived, the Thompson family. Eager to escape their own troubles, had heard of the Plantation house and were drawn to its charm. They too only saw the beauty and history of the place, unaware of the blood-soaked past that lay hidden within its walls. As they moved in, their son Alex wandered the house, exploring every creaky floorboard and dusty corner. But as he passed the old study, he heard a strange noise, a soft whisper, like a voice calling to him. He froze, listening intently, but the voice faded as quickly as it had come. Shrugging it off, Alex turned and walked away, unaware that the past was still very much alive, and that the house would never let go of its secrets. And so, the cycle continued.